This shocking event occurred before sunrise. No gunfire, no headlines, just a document, stamped in silence, circulated like a ghost. And by dawn, two of Cameroon's largest opposition coalitions had been erased, not debated, not disqualified, just gone, like a name wiped from a blackboard. There was no trial, no defense, no warning. Only a quiet decree from the Ministry of Territorial Administration, dissolving decades of democratic work in a single breath. And the country did not erupt. It exhaled, in confusion, in disbelief, in quiet dread. Newspapers printed nothing. State television repeated the same phrase, electoral stability. But in the alley cafes of Douala and the student dorms of Boué, silence began to carry a new weight, because everyone knew what it meant. When power no longer needs to shout, it whispers. And when it whispers, through legal language, through invisible barriers, through locked bank accounts and vanished networks, that is when the fear runs deepest. So we ask, not as journalists, not as outsiders, but as human beings, what do you call a nation where opposition is outlawed without a word, where memory becomes contraband, where freedom is not crushed, but quietly erased? This is not a documentary, it is a mirror, a warning, a question that cannot be ignored. Because if a government can silence its people without violence, who will dare to speak when the silence becomes law? Have you ever felt your heart shatter in silence? Watching our motherland, Africa, drained of her treasures, while children sleep hungry, curled in torn clothes, bones visible in the cold. It is beyond pain. It is injustice. We have suffered enough. Now is the time to rise. We, the children of the Black Continent, must unite, stand tall, and shout to the world. We deserve life, growth, and dignity. Share this video. Let our voices reach the heavens. Let God see our courage. Comment your location. Like and subscribe. For a free, proud, and thriving Africa. In March 2024, before the sun could rise, two of the largest opposition coalitions in Cameroon were erased. Not by trial, not by vote, but by a quiet document, a government circular, signed and stamped by the Ministry of Territorial Administration. No courtroom, no defense, no warning, just gone. The names were Loum, Unmo, and Frula Cameroon. Movements that took decades to build vanished overnight. Websites were blocked, interviews deleted, public rallies labeled illegal, mobile money accounts, the lifelines of grassroots fundraising, were frozen. To the regime, it was a protective measure. To legal scholars, a constitutional bypass. But to citizens, it felt like something else entirely. Fear, dressed as order, and fear moved fast. State-run media repeated the message more than 100 times, stability above all. But in the alleys of Douala and the student dorms of Boué, silence was not submission. It was a signal. Encrypted networks began to form. WhatsApp groups renamed themselves with quotes from Mandela and Sankara. University flyers were passed by airdrop instead of printed paper. The more the state tried to cut off air, the more people learned to breathe differently. To be part of a banned group became an honor. Being silenced turned into a badge. And every police raid, every deleted post, only added fuel. Opposition was no longer a political position, it was a culture. By April, the government had aired over 140 stories defending electoral calm. Not a single opposition voice was allowed to speak, but silence was not empty. On TikTok, a short clip went viral. It showed an empty chair at a student debate. The guest had been banned, a young politician barred from public speaking. The caption read, "You can block the body, but never the idea." Within a day, it reached over 500,000 views. And when two student journalists were arrested in May for digital sedition, a strange thing happened. Thousands changed their profile pictures to black squares. No captions, no hashtags, just darkness. It was not a trend, it was a warning. The more the regime erased, the more people remembered. This was not resistance with fire or fists. It was with rhythm and repetition. The state was using laws like a sword, but the people had found a shield in memory. Graffiti started appearing on city walls. Slogans like, You cannot ban the future, and 42 years is not destiny. The government dismissed it as youthful foolishness. But at the University of Chang, professors called it something else. The pre-political awakening, not a revolution, a rehearsal. It was not just about Cameroon anymore. It was a message to every corner of the continent. That you can silence a speech, you can dissolve a party, but you cannot kill the hunger for dignity. What makes this story powerful is not just the scale of suppression. It is how the people responded, not with chaos, but with creativity, with memory, with defiance that did not need microphones. Because in Cameroon, the silence of power created something unexpected. A generation that learned to speak without speaking. A generation that knows that even if you cut the network, the message still finds its way. In August 2024, the silence broke, but not with sound. It broke with absence. Maurice Kamto, the former Minister of Justice, a legal scholar and respected voice in Cameroonian civic life, was arrested. The charges were strange and slippery: inciting insurrection, disturbing public order, and most bizarre of all, damaging the image of the Republic abroad. His crime? A peaceful march in Douala, holding a handwritten sign. It read, "Give us the ballot, not the baton." There were no fires, no violence, no angry speeches, just a walk, a message, and a camera. But that was enough. Within hours, Kamto vanished into what legal experts began calling the gray zone. Detained, but not charged. Held, but not acknowledged. No trial, no official updates, no location. For 5 days, he became a ghost. And that was the point. The strategy was psychological, not dramatic, not loud. The regime wanted no headlines, no sympathy, no courtroom cameras, only uncertainty. Because when the rules become invisible, fear multiplies. And fear in the unknown is the most dangerous kind. They called it gray detention. But its real power was not in punishing Kamto. It was in warning everyone else. University lecturers removed his writings from their syllabi. Student groups cancelled forums. Civil society paused their projects. Opposition leaders fell quiet. A wave of self-censorship swept across the country. Not because of what was said, but because no one knew what line had been crossed. If Kamto could be taken, who was safe? But fear, like pressure, does not only suppress, sometimes it transforms. The more the regime tried to erase him, the more he became a story. Street artists began painting his silhouette. Eyes closed, hands raised, as if still holding that sign. Stickers appeared on laptops. T-shirts, with his quote, circulated silently. "Law is the soul of the Republic." They tried to bury him with silence, but he became folklore. Then came the voice notes. Encrypted audio clips passed through Signal and WhatsApp. Not speeches, just fragments of his writings. Where there is no justice, there is no peace, no music, no edits. Just his words, raw, real, remembered. Inside the walls of Kondengui prison, Kamto was reportedly offered release in exchange for silence. He refused. According to multiple sources, he scribbled his response on the back of a legal memo. "I would rather be buried with my words than walk without them." By November, under growing international pressure and quiet tension at home, he was released. No charges, no explanation, no apology. But outside those prison walls, the country had changed. His students met him with silence and roses, a symbolic protest that spoke louder than chants. In Buea, a short video of him greeting a vendor reached over 1 million views. No speech, just presence. At a youth summit in December, a delegate stood and introduced him not as former minister, not as candidate, but as the one who stood while others bowed. The irony was brutal. The government tried to strip him of his oxygen. Instead, they turned him into a symbolic flame. Not a man. A message. By January 2025, nearly half of young Cameroonians no longer called him a politician. They called him a moral compass. Artists held exhibits across cities. Each one featured an empty chair, draped in white cloth. The title was simple: absent but present. In trying to silence Kamto, The regime built him into something more powerful than any campaign, a conscience. By the end of 2024, Maurice Kamto was no longer just a name. He was not even just a person. He had become something else, a shadow that the regime could not touch, a symbol that needed no speech, no stage. He became memory. And memory, in times of silence, becomes resistance. In city alleys and campus cafes, Kamto's quotes echoed without being spoken. Street murals showed only his silhouette, a man seated, hands open, eyes shut. Some called it the empty chair. Others called it the future waiting. Either way, it spoke louder than any campaign banner. The regime stopped mentioning him altogether. No praise, no critique. He was neither attacked nor defended. It was as if they believed that by ignoring him, he would fade. But stories do not fade when they are carved in silence. Artists stitched his quotes into quilts. Law students passed down his writings as whispered teachings. His name appeared not in headlines, but in hashtags, passwords, usernames. A presence hidden in plain sight. And then came the diaspora. From Montreal to Berlin, Cameroonians abroad began to move. They did not call for war. They called for truth. In Canada, exiled professors briefed lawmakers. In Germany, students held vigils outside parliament buildings, holding nothing but candles and photos of that same empty chair. In France, young activists launched a digital campaign called Silence is Complicity. It reached over 1 million views in less than 2 weeks. These were not cries for foreign intervention. They were demands for recognition. They were saying, "We are watching. We remember. We will not look away." In Buea, a group of women gathered each week to stitch cancelled voter cards into a tapestry, each card embroidered with a name, a story. They called it the fabric of forgotten votes. It was not a protest. It was a reminder, a memory you could touch. In university cafes, students began mapping zones of voter suppression. No formal training, just laptops and fury. In Kongsamba, a spoken word artist released a piece titled, "My Ballot is a Bullet of Memory." It was not loud, but it was unforgettable. The regime had misunderstood something fundamental. It believed silence would bring obedience. But silence, in a nation wounded by erasure, had become the soil where resistance grew. Not in the streets, not in the speeches, but in the stories. And when you cannot kill a story, you cannot control the future. What began as an attempt to erase one man had evolved into something the state could no longer predict. A movement that did not depend on leaders, parties, or campaigns. A movement that fed on memory. And memory, once awakened, does not need permission to survive. In October 2016, the streets of Buea and Bamenda were not yet burning. They were marching. Teachers held chalk, not weapons. Lawyers wore robes, not armor. Their message was simple. Respect. Respect for language, for identity, for justice in English, for schools and courts to hear the voices of the Anglophone regions. But the government responded with tear gas, not dialogue. Rubber bullets instead of reform. Within 72 hours, the air changed. Classrooms became battlegrounds. Protesters were arrested. And a message was sent. Sit down and be silent. But silence is never the end. It is the beginning of something darker. By early 2017, the calls for reform had become calls for independence. Young men who once taught math or repaired motorcycles were now in the forest, holding rifles, swearing loyalty to a flag that did not exist on paper, the flag of Ambazonia. When soldiers torched villages in retaliation, separatist fighters returned fire. What began as protest turned into a shadow war. Schools shut down. Hospitals burned. Entire districts became no-go zones. Then came the silence. On the 17th of January, 2017, at exactly 11:30 at night, the internet vanished. For 93 straight days, over 4 million people in the northwest and southwest regions were digitally erased. No messages, no bank transfers, no video calls. A blackout not just of information, but of identity. One doctor called it a surgical strike against truth. The government claimed it was to stop misinformation. But what it stopped was evidence of violence, of suffering, of abandonment. Journalists could not upload footage. Humanitarian workers lost contact with teams. Mothers could not speak to sons abroad. Students lost access to school. For one of Africa's most connected youth populations, the damage was not just technical, it was emotional. It was generational. By 2018, the separatists had built their own systems, uniforms, checkpoints, schools, courts. In many villages, it was no longer Paul Biya's face on the wall. It was the flag of Ambazonia. A government had lost control, not because of a coup, but because it refused to listen. The regime never called it war, only security operations. But those on the ground lived another reality. Code alerts on local radio replaced warnings. 3 chimes meant roadblocks. 4 meant soldier nearby. 5 meant run. By 2025, nearly a decade later, the conflict still had no name, no solution, no reconciliation, just more guns, more silence, and more children learning when to run, when to lie, when to speak, and when to disappear. The greatest wound was not just physical, it was psychological. The state had not just lost the battle, it had lost trust. A war that started with a plea to be heard had become a lesson in what happens when a nation chooses denial over dialogue. And for many, that silence spoke louder than any slogan. So what do we do when democracy is not taken by force, but erased with paperwork? When elections become rituals, not choices? When the loudest protest is no longer shouting in the streets, but sitting in silence? In Cameroon, this is no longer theory. It is reality. Opposition parties banned with no trial. Voters erased from lists, leaders detained without charge, and a people asked to accept it quietly. But silence is never neutral. It is either consent or resistance. Across the country, something is shifting. Artists, students, mothers, exiles, they are remembering, they are documenting, they are speaking, even when they whisper. A graffiti slogan, a WhatsApp voice note, an empty chair at a student debate. These are not just symbols, they are survival. Because if power can cancel votes, if it can vanish voices, if it can delete names, what it cannot delete is memory. And memory, when shared, becomes truth. This is not only about Cameroon, it is about all of us. About what we allow, what we ignore, what we excuse. Because indifference is not peace, it is permission. So we ask you, wherever you are, do not scroll past this story. Do not let silence win. Share this video. Let the world hear. Let the heavens see the courage of a continent still rising. Like, comment, and subscribe, not just for content, but for conscience. Because the dream of a free Africa needs witnesses. And your voice might be the one that breaks the silence. My name is Amina Yusuf. I was born and raised in Kano, in the north of Nigeria, a city of ancient walls, bustling markets, and deep pride. But today, my heart is heavy, watching the story of Cameroon unfold. The arrests, the silence, the stolen voices. It does not feel like a distant country. It feels like home. Because here in Nigeria, I have seen the same fear in the eyes of my neighbors. I have felt the same hopelessness creep in when promises are broken and leaders stop listening. But I have also seen something else, something they cannot take. A fire in our souls, a determination that says, even in silence, we remember who we are. I believe in Africa rising, not as a speech from a stage, but as a truth whispered in the corners of classrooms, painted on the walls of our streets, and sung in the voices of our children. I believe, because I see it. In every farmer who still plants seeds despite drought, in every girl who walks miles to reach school, in every mother who teaches peace when the world teaches fear. I dream of a new Africa, where no child goes hungry while leaders grow fat, where internet blackouts cannot erase our truth, where the vote is not a ritual, but a right. I want a continent where leaders fear the people, not the other way around, where justice walks in daylight, not hides in shadows. To me, Africa reborn means we stop running from ourselves, we stop blaming each other, we stop waiting for others to fix what we can rebuild. We have everything: land, minds, culture, spirit. What we need is each other. Unity, vision, courage. I want to see African students not just survive, but invent. I want our artists to be funded, our women to lead, our diaspora to return. Not in pain, but in purpose. This is the Africa rising I see every time my little brother teaches himself coding by candlelight. This is the Africa rising I hear in the poetry shouted across campus halls. This is the Africa rising I feel in my bones, even when the news tells me to despair. The new Africa is not about perfect governments. It is about informed citizens, strong communities, shared hope. And Africa reborn is not a dream, it is a decision, a daily one. We are not victims, we are visionaries. So I say this from Kano, from the heart of Nigeria. We must never let them tell us who we are. We must write it ourselves, together, for the world to hear. Because Africa rising is not coming, it is already here, and it speaks through me.